to interviews from Quito. Today we'll be speaking with Diego Zorrilla, Resident Coordinator of the United Nations in Ecuador. Welcome, Mr. Zorrilla.
Thank you very much.
For this wonderful interview, and we're going to talk about some topics about the United Nations and Ecuador.
Thanks for having me.
This June, Ecuador and the United Nations signed a cooperation, an agreement to support the National Plan for Good Living. What is the scope of this cooperation agreement?
Well, it's a framework agreement for the cooperation of all of the UN agencies in Ecuador. There is something like 16 UN agencies. You know, there's a proliferation of UN agencies that are dedicated to specific topics and to advancing specific issues. This is a framework agreement that provides an umbrella for all 16 agencies that allows us to operate in the country for the next 4 years. And it's very important in a country like Ecuador that has recovered a very strong role for the state and a very strong role for planning, that international cooperation is aligned to the national priorities. And that's what we try to ensure with our cooperation agreement, which is fully aligned with the Plan Nacional del Buen Vivir, which is the name that Ecuadorians give, which is in English would translate as the National Plan for Good Living, which is the national development plan for the next 4 years. Every time that the government is in place, the president has to present a new national development plan for his tenure in office for the following 4 years.
Could you tell us about the agreement help fight discrimination and inequality in Ecuador?
Well, this is an issue in Ecuador. I mean, Ecuador has managed to reduce poverty quite significantly, and has also reduced inequities quite significantly too. It's actually the country in Latin America that has reduced inequities at the highest rate. That's the difference between the 20% of the population that have more and the 20% that have less. Still, Ecuador is embedded in a continent, Latin America, which is the most unequal continent in the world. So one of our purposes through our programming is to help Ecuadorian government and to help Ecuadorian society overcome the inequities that exist. And some of these inequities are due to discrimination. I mean, if we had to put a face to poverty in Ecuador, it will have the face of a woman, an indigenous woman. So there's a strong difference between the levels of income, the levels of education, still, in spite of all the efforts that are being done between different groups of the population. This is reflected in an atlas. We carried out an exercise last year supporting the government in designing an atlas of inequities in the country that goes municipality per municipality, and even at a lower level, level of parroquias, which is the lowest administrative level in Ecuador, to show the inequities that exist in the country still.
You're talking about percentages of poverty in South America. What are the percentages in Ecuador compared to the countries in South America, and why is that? What is the Ecuadorian government doing about this, as you see it as the United Nations?
Well, Ecuador has managed to reduce in the last 6 or 7 years extreme poverty from 19% to less than 9%, now. And this is due to a combination of measures. I mean, there has been a very strong, a very sustained investment, both in infrastructure, there has been investment in the social sector, and there has been investment in ensuring that people have social safety nets, which did not exist before. All of this, plus the creation of employment, and the fact that many more people are now employed in the formal sector rather than informal sector, and they also have, there has been a strong push also for people to affiliate to the social security. So all of these measures combined have resulted in a reduction into the levels of extreme poverty. Now, the next challenge is to actually eradicate extreme poverty. And this is the challenge that the government has set itself to do, and it's a challenge that we are happy to support. And we support this through a variety of programs in the United Nations. I mean, be it from developing agricultural methods and helping the government with agricultural methods, from that to generation of employment, to providing social safety nets to the population, and to a variety of measures.
Good. Could you tell us about this agreement has to do with protecting the environment also?
That's an important feature of the country, and it's an agenda that has been embraced very strongly. I mean, the Constitution of 2008 recognizes the rights of nature. I mean, it recognizes nature as being a holder of rights under the Constitution. And there is a strong, there is a reality with which we live in Ecuador, is that Ecuador is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. It has a very big reserve in the Amazon. It has a very high number of parks, national parks. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it is the country of Latin America that has the highest percentage of its territory which is protected under national parks. But there is a lot of pressures on the environment. One of the pressures comes from the exploitation of natural resources, where the government strives to ensure, but this has not been the case in the past, and strives to ensure that this exploitation of natural resources is done in ways which are respectful of the environment. And then there is the safeguards which are embedded there. I mean, we in the United Nations are guided by conventions. We support governments to achieve their obligations and to meet their obligations under international conventions. One of them is the Framework Convention for Climate Change, and we support the government with their policies to control climate change in the country.
For an American audience, could you tell us how would you describe the significance of the Ecuadorian National Plan for Good Living?
Well, it's a concept. I mean, it's a concept that has, in fact, it's a concept that's actually quite close to what we in the UN are propagate or defend, which is the sustainable development in reality. I mean, it's a national good living. It's a concept that seeks to ensure that there is growth, economic growth, but growth that is centered on the human being, that actually benefits humans, and that is respectful with the environment. So it's the three elements of sustainable development, which is there has to be economic growth, of course, and the country has sustained economic growth for the past years. But at the same time, this growth must benefit and must translate into a reduction of poverty, into increased opportunities for the inhabitants of Ecuador, for citizens of Ecuador, and at the same time be respectful of the environment. It's a difficult equation, but this is the goal that's being set by the government. Of course, there are setbacks, but this is what the government wants to defend as its proposal, and this is what we're here to support.
Can you speak about the notion of development centered in the human being?
Well, it's a little bit, it's the recognition that economic growth per se does not necessarily translate into benefits for everyone equally. So economic growth is necessary, but at the same time there needs to be measures put in place to ensure that this economic growth translates into increased investments in education, in health, and once you've covered the very basics, then you go into greater levels of involvement, ensuring, for example, early childhood development, which is absolutely crucial, and helping people have better nutrition habits in ways that the economic wealth that is generated and the economic growth of the country actually translates into an improvement in the ordinary lives of citizens.
And some of the measures are education too.
Education has been a great, very important push for the government. I mean, we have to say that the government has benefited. Ecuador is an oil exporting country. I mean, this might be not known to everyone, but it is an oil exporting country. I mean, oil exports are an important part of the revenue of the state and of the exports of the overall exports of the country. Actually, this is a challenge for Ecuador. Ecuador has now to diversify its productive metrics. I mean, this is the big mantra now for the government, is to ensure that it diversifies its productive metrics so that it reduces its dependence on the exports of oil. But the exporters of oil and in general the growth of the economy, coupled with a very good level of prices of oil in the international markets, has allowed the government to have an unprecedented level of resources that have been employed very diligently, I think, in increasing the spending in education and health. I believe that, and don't want to give you a wrong figure, but I think that the investment in education has been multiplied by 5 over the course of the last years, which is a huge investment. And there has been a lot of attention to primary education, to secondary education, but also to universities, and with a very, with an unprecedented and I think unparalleled in many levels policy, public policy to give scholarships to students that study abroad. So a very great number of Ecuadorians are actually now studying abroad in universities abroad, because there's a recognition that the level of universities in the country, even though some of them are very good and many of them are actually improving their standards, that Ecuador needs to ensure that it has citizens that are trained in the best universities in the world, and there is a program to ensure that.
You're talking about the three measurements, which is health, education, and the third one was?
Well, early childhood development is also an important factor that contributes to an improvement in the lives of people. Yes.
And this cooperation agreement speaks about the interest of a part of the United Nations to adapt their global programs to local concerns.
Yes, that's an important aspect of the work of the United Nations. I mean, the United Nations, through its fora, and when we talk about the United Nations, there are different levels of understanding of what the United Nations is. It is first and foremost a club of countries. I mean, it is first and foremost a group of countries that are bound together by treaties, and that adopt by a treaty, the founding treaty for the United Nations, and that adopt other treaties and state standards on a variety of issues and a variety of fields. And through these treaties or through these standards, countries become committed to achieving certain levels. I mean, we now have, there used to be a discourse that was, this discourse that I'm defending here about investing in the poor and about investing in health, investing in education, used to be before the preserve of a certain ideology. It is no longer that. I mean, it is now, these are become universal concepts. I mean, I think that now all countries are now obliged to actually ensure these minimum standards for their citizens. What the United Nations does is that through its agencies, funds and programs, that we have specialized knowledge, we have some resources, but we're able to tap into specialized knowledge, and we're able to provide technical advice to countries to help them meet their obligations under these standards, under these agreements. So this is what we do in a country like Ecuador. I mean, it is no longer an issue of resources, because in fact, we don't have many resources, and certainly, compared to the budget of the state, the resources we bring to the country are very, very limited. But what we do bring is an attention to international standards and the provision of the assistance, of technical assistance, and then ensuring that there is accompanying the government and the other functions of the state in ensuring that they meet these international standards.
Mr. Soria, can you tell us about, in recent interviews, I found that you have argued that human development has slowed down on the planet. Why is that?
It is true. I mean, we are seeing that even though there has been, as I said, a strong push by many governments, and this is towards achieving higher human development indexes for their populations. And what we call human development is a combination of income, education, and health. So that the three measures have to be there. And the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, measures the Human Development Index of countries since the 1990s. And there has been a steady progression. I mean, most countries have improved. I mean, they improve their income, but they also improve the levels of health and of education for their populations. At the same time, we've seen that big gains have been done in the past decades, but that these gains are sometimes slowing down, or they even can be reversed if there is not enough measures that are put in place in societies to be resilient towards events that might strike these societies. I mean, the most dramatic example is, of course, war, and war or even natural disasters that can actually bring back, these are setbacks that can bring countries back in their development index many years. I mean, we've seen that floods, etc., and not to mention armed conflict, of course, which is the biggest element that can actually slow down development, but also not paying enough attention to the creation of employment, not paying enough attention to early childhood development. All of these are factors of vulnerability that can actually make that citizens, people that have strived to live themselves out of poverty, many times thanks to the intervention of governments, and I think that the role of governments needs to be acknowledged. I mean, this doesn't happen just by virtue of the natural willpower of the individual, and this is governments have a role to regulate and to promote conditions that ensure that people can develop their lives in a better way. But we've seen that these people that have strived to live themselves out of poverty can actually fall back into poverty if these measures to ensure that they are resilient and the societies are resilient are not put in place.
How do you see the current situation in Ecuador with regard to the human development?
It's improving. I mean, it has improved steadily. I mean, Ecuador has made a progress, has progressed in its human development index steadily over the last 20 years. And the acceleration in the progress has been actually more pronounced over the last 8 or 10 years, due a lot to the social policies that I've just mentioned. I mean, Ecuadorians now, an Ecuadorian that is born today, can basically expect to live something like 10 or 15 years longer than his parents expected to live at the time they were born. And also his expectation to get an education is also much, much higher than it used to be. So these elements are elements which translate into a progression and into an improvement in the Human Development Index for the country, and that translates also into improvements in the individual lives of citizens. Still, there is, as I mentioned before, 9% of people living in extreme poverty, which is totally unacceptable to all of us. And this also translates, this also is reflected in the high number of people living in extreme poverty in the world. Actually, now the world, as you know, is engaged into defining the new objectives, global development goals for the post-2015. Why 2015? Because now we are living under, we are striving to complete the Millennium Development Goals that were adopted in the year 2000 and that have an horizon until the year 2015. Now we're defining the new, we meaning the world, all of us, are defining the new post-2015 development goals that will have to be adopted in September 2015 by the General Assembly of the United Nations. After a long process of consultations that has involved many, many stakeholders across the world in virtually all countries of the world, and the main objective will remain to fight extreme poverty in the world.
What are the main goals that you're looking at for the 2015 that hasn't happened in the last 20 years?
Well, I think first, these goals have not yet been defined. I mean, there's been now a long consultative process that has involved, on the one hand, the negotiations between countries, and which will have to be intensified until September 2015. And there's been a consultation process with civil society and with various groups in many, many countries. Mm-hmm. The recognition is that the Millennium Development Goals were extremely useful in focusing the world's attention on a few tangible goals that had also targets, clear targets that were assigned to these goals. But there's a recognition that the process through which we arrived at these goals was not consultative enough. Now there is a new set of goals that is going to be negotiated and agreed upon that will probably be, as regards to poverty, fighting hunger, fighting poverty, reducing maternal mortality, these things will continue to be there, I mean, I'm certain, but probably there will be other goals that are added with a greater sense of responsibility. It's no longer the obligation of the countries of the South to meet these goals, which is a little bit the way that the original goals were designed, but it's our collective responsibility, and that involves all countries in the world to ensure that the new goals are met.
Mr. Soria, you've been working with the United Nations over 20 years.
Correct.
Now, what attracted you to join the United Nations?
Well, that's a very that's a question I was not expecting. Really, the goals of the United Nations are really very inspiring. I mean, I think that the goals for which the organization was set are goals that are very inspiring and that are can easily motivate young people in particular, and they motivated me at the time I joined the United Nations, and they continue to motivate me. One thing is that the United Nations collectively, we fell very short of meeting these goals, and the other thing is that these goals as an aspiration are very worthy and should remain there. As I said, there are various aspects to the United Nations. One thing is the group of countries that constitute the United Nations and that negotiate between themselves, and there we see that many times there are tensions, dissensions, disagreements that impede arriving at the agreements that would be necessary in order to meet to the full extent the goals of the nations. I mean, we see how the United Nations, the political world or the United Nations, these negotiations, the Security Council sometimes are blocked because of the interest of groups of countries, and as a result of that, the United Nations cannot engage into collective action for the main purpose for which it was established, which is to maintain world peace. And we see now that there are very important conflicts which are not being addressed directly by the United Nations in the way that we would hope, and that the world would hope, because of these tensions and disagreements. That's one part of the United Nations. There's another part of the United Nations to which I belong, which is the body of civil servants that are there to carry out the mandates and to provide support to the organs of the United Nations where the decisions are made. And in that function, and I'm very happy to be serving in this function for over 20 years now, in this function we strive to be objective, to be neutral, and to provide the best solutions, or to put at the disposal of countries that have to take decisions the best possible solutions in the interest of people and of the ideas of the United Nations. And then there is the specialized funds, programs, etc., that have been set for particular purposes and to meet certain objectives that are important to the world. For example, protecting refugees. For example, ensuring the protection of the environment. For example, ensuring that agriculture is developed in ways which are sustainable and that yield better results for farmers, etc. And I think this is also a very worthy and if I dare say, noble undertaking, and I'm very happy to be working for them.
Just to wrap things up, I know your time is short.
No,
and very happy that you can be with us here in Telesur. How do you envision Ecuador in the future? And also, can you tell us how you see the United Nations as a human being in the next 20 years?
Well, Ecuador, I think, is in an, I hope, in an irreversible path towards greater development. I think that as I said, the country is in a good direction for ensuring that it continues in a path of development that is centered in the human being and then translates into benefits for all the people, all the people of Ecuador. The continuation, there is now a big strategy to eradicate poverty in the country. There's a strategy to change the productive matrix. There are certain things that you do with education that empower people, that make people, that the demands of people become higher, and that in turn forces governments to actually ensure that they are there to meet those demands. So I think that in this sense, I think it's a very, very positive path. At the same time, it's a path that's fraught with difficulties ahead. I mean, the levels of spending of the government need to be sustainable, and that's why there needs to make sure that there are other sources of revenue other than oil, which are being explored. As for the United Nations, for the United Nations in this country and for the United Nations in general in the world, I mean, my hope is that we continue to be a relevant actor in providing assistance to the government and in providing a voice also to civil society organizations in the country and support civil society organizations to ensure that the very principles for which the United Nations was founded, which is to generate, to ensure that there is peace, to generate development, and to generate inclusion, are actually met in Ecuador. In the world, I hope that the United Nations will continue to be the place that has been for the past 60 years of existence, a place where differences of opinion can be expressed, but at the same time where agreements can be promoted, and where slowly, if you see the history of the United Nations, things that were considered completely impossible only a few years back, like rights of women, the mere concept of human rights, how they become ingrained in the agendas of governments, in the agendas of civil society, and they become ingrained in our minds and in our psyche. And now we take for granted things that were discussed at the United Nations and that were initially seen as revolutionary. And through the work of the United Nations, through the work of discussion, and through the involvement of many actors, and the United Nations is first and foremost that. It's a platform to unite many actors, governments, but also civil society organizations, actors in the private sector, and citizens at large. And that through this work, these concepts become ingrained, and things that a few years back we didn't even talk about, like protection of the environment, are now considered a must by the citizens of the world.
Thank you, Mr. Zorrilla, for your time.
Thank you.
Addressing some of the topics with the United Nations in Ecuador. It's been Diego Zorrilla, the resident coordinator of the United Nations in Ecuador. My name is Andres Sebastian. This is Quito. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.